The crystal champagne flute shattered against the wall, barely missing my head. Shards of glass rained down, guttering under the chandeliers like a twisted parody of confetti. The room fell silent, all eyes locked on me and my wife, Sarah, her face contorted with rage and too much expensive bubbly. "You ungrateful bastard," she screamed, our designer dress askew, mascara running down her cheeks. "You're nothing without us. Nothing." I stood there frozen as the weight of a decade's worth of insults, snide comments and thinly veiled contempt came crushing down on me. The room was packed with the crème de la crème of New York society, titans of industry, old-money socialites, up-and-coming entrepreneurs. All here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Rothschild Enterprises, the company I'd poured my heart and soul into for the past 10 years. And now, here I was being eviscerated by my own wife in front of them all. Something inside me snapped, a lifetime of trying to fit in, of bending over backwards to please these people, of ignoring the constant reminders that I didn't truly belong. It all came to a head in that moment. I straightened my spine, looked Sarah dead in the eye, and said in a voice that carried across the stunned ballroom, "You're right about one thing, Sarah. I am nothing like you or your toxic world, and thank God for that." I turned to address the room, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. But effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Rothschild Enterprises." The gasps and murmurs that filled the air were almost comical. I caught sight of my mother-in-law, Evelyn, clutching her pearls in horror. Good. Let them all clutch their pearls. And while I'm at it, I continued, a weight lifting off my shoulders with each word. I'm also resigning from this farce of a marriage. Sarah, honey, you can keep it all. The money, the status, the ability to look down on everyone around you. I'm done. With that, I yanked off my bow tie, tossed it dramatically to the floor. I'll admit I was feeling a bit theatrical at this point, and strode out of the ballroom. The last thing I heard before the heavy doors swung shut behind me was Sarah's enraged shriek, and the sound of another champagne flute meeting its untimely end against the wall. As I stood in the opulent hallway of the Plaza Hotel, my heart racing and hands shaking, I couldn't help but laugh. It was a slightly manic sound, tinged with equal parts terror and exhilaration. What the hell had I just done? But let me back up a bit. You're probably wondering how a guy like me, Jake Thompson, son of a steelworker from Buffalo, ended up in the middle of this Gatsby-esque drama. Well, it's a long story and I've got nothing but time now. So grab a drink, maybe not champagne, and let me tell you how it all began. It was a crisp autumn day in the Adirondacks, leaves crunching under my warm hiking boots as I made my way along the Avalanche Pass Trail. I was in my senior year at CUNY Buffalo, studying business and dreaming of making it big someday. But for now, I was just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, trying to clear my head in the mountains whenever I could scrape together enough gas money for the trip. That's when I heard it, a cry for help, occurring off the rocky cliffs. I quickened my pace, heart pounding as I rounded a bend in the trail. And there she was, Sarah Rothschild, though I didn't know it at the time. All I saw was a woman in trouble, downing precariously from a ledge, her hiking pole just out of reach. "Hold on," I shouted, scrambling down the slope towards her. "I'm coming." As I inched closer, our eyes met. Even in that moment of panic, I couldn't help but notice how strikingly beautiful she was, all windswept blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. I pushed the foot aside, focusing on the task at hand. "Give me your hand," I said, stretching out as far as I could without losing my own footing. She reached for me, her fingers brushing mine. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I might not be able to reach her. But then our hands clasped, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I hauled her up onto solid ground. We collapsed onto the rocky outcrop, both breathing heavily. As the danger passed, the absurdity of the situation hit us, and we burst out laughing, that slightly hysterical laughter of those who've just cheated death. "My hero," she said, flashing me a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm Sarah." "Jake," I replied, suddenly very aware of how close we were sitting. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. Though I guess I would have preferred less life-threatening circumstances." She laughed again, a sound I would come to both love and hate in the years to come. Where's the fun in that? We hiked back to the trailhead together, chatting the whole way. Sarah was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Smart, funny, and seemingly interested in everything I had to say. By the time we reached her car, a sleek Audi that should have been my first clue, I was completely smitten. "So, Jake," she said, leaning against the car door. "What do you say we grab a drink sometime to celebrate my daring rescue?" Who was I to refuse? That drink turned into dinner, which turned into a whirlwind romance that would change the course of my life. Sarah was a force of nature, sweeping me up into her world of art galleries, charity gathers, and weekend jaunts to Martha's Vineyard. It wasn't until a few months in that I realized just how different our worlds really were. We were at some trendy rooftop bar in Manhattan. Sarah sipping a $30 cocktail while I nursed a beer, when she casually mentioned her family's summer home near the Hamptons. The Hamptons? I sputtered, nearly choking on my drink. As in, playground of the rich and famous. She laughed, that tinking sound that still made my heart race. "Oh, Jake, you're adorable. Did you really not know?" That's when she filled me in on the Rothschild empire, the real estate holdings, the hedge funds, the philanthropic foundations. It was like finding out I was dating American royalty. I'll admit it was intimidating as hell. But Sarah never made me feel less than. If anything, she seemed to find my regular guy status charming. "You're real, Jake," she'd say, curling up next to me on my ratty futon, in my shoebox of an apartment. "That's what I love about you." Things got serious fast. Before I knew it, Sarah was introducing me to her father, Richard Rothschild. I expected some stern, imposing figure, but Richard turned out to be surprisingly down-to-earth for a man who could buy and sell small countries. "So, Jake," he said one night over cigars on the terrace of their Park Avenue penthouse, "Sarah tells me you're studying business. What's your take on the current market volatility?" I hesitated for a moment, acutely aware that this man forgot more about business than I'd ever know. But then I took a deep breath and dove in, sharing my thoughts on risk management and emerging market opportunities. To my surprise, Richard muttered along, looking genuinely interested. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, son," he said, capping me on the back. "We should talk more." Those talks became a regular thing. Richard took me under his wing, sharing insights and war stories from his years in the cutthroat world of high finance. It was like having a personal mentor, and I soaked up every bit of knowledge I could. When I graduated, Richard made me an offer I couldn't refuse, a junior executive position at Rothschild Enterprises. It was a huge leap from the entry-level jobs I'd been applying for, but Richard insisted I had potential. "You've got the hunger, Jake," he said. "That's something you can't teach." I threw myself into the work, determined to prove I deserved the chance Richard had given me. The learning curve was steep, but I thrived on the challenge. I spent long nights poring over financial reports, attending every meeting I could, and volunteering for projects no one else wanted. Sarah cheered me on every step of the way, at least at first. We got married in a lavish ceremony that made the society pages. Rothschild Harris wed self-made man, the headlines blared. I felt like I was living a fairy tale, the ordinary guy who'd won the heart of the princess and earned the king's favor. For the next decade, I climbed the corporate ladder at Rothschild Enterprises. I had a knack for spotting emerging markets and negotiating deals. Under my leadership, we expanded into tech startups and sustainable energy projects. The company's profits soared, and I started making a name for myself beyond just being Sarah Rothschild's husband. Then tragedy struck. Richard died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving a gaping hole in both the company and our family. In his will, he named me as his successor. "Jake's the future of this company," he'd written. "Trust him to lead you forward." At first, things were great. Sarah was proud of me, the board respected me, and I felt like I was honoring Richard's legacy. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with little comments from Sarah. "Daddy would have done it this way," she'd say, or "Are you sure that's the best decision?" I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to grief. But as time went on, her criticisms became more pointed, more public. It was as if she resented my success, as if every win for me was somehow a loss for her father's memory. At a charity gala about a year after Richard's death, I overheard Sarah talking to some of her socialite friends. "Oh, Jake's doing his best," she said with a patronizing laugh. "But you know, he's not from our world, sometimes it shows." It stung, but I told myself she didn't mean it. I doubled down on my work, determined to prove my worth. But the more success I had, the more Sarah seemed to resent it. "You know, all of this was already in place when Daddy hired you," she'd say, gesturing around our opulent penthouse. "You're just riding his coattails." I tried to reason with her, to remind her of all we built together, but it was like talking to a wall. The warm, supportive woman I'd fallen in love with had been replaced by a cold, status-obsessed stranger. As the years went on, the rift between us grew. Sarah threw herself into the social scene, hosting lavish parties and charity events while I worked longer and longer hours. We barely saw each other, and when we did, it was usually at some function where we had to play the happy couple for the cameras. I buried myself in work, using it as an escape from the growing emptiness in my personal life. I expanded the company into new territories, always pushing for that next big deal, that next achievement that might finally make Sarah look at me the way she used to. But it was never enough. The more I accomplished, the more Sarah seemed to pull away. It was like she couldn't stand the idea that I might actually be good at this, that I might be more than just the charity case her father had taken in. The final straw came on the night of that fateful 50th anniversary gala. I'd just closed a massive deal, one that would cement Rothschild Enterprises as a major player in the emerging green energy market. I was on top of the world, riding high on the success. As I finished my speech about our record-breaking quarter, I caught sight of Sarah in the crowd. Instead of pride or even grudging approval, all I saw in her eyes was contempt. She sidled up to me at the bar, champagne flute in hand. "Nice speech, darling," she said, her words slightly slurred. "Did you have someone write it for you?" I felt my face flush. "Sarah, please, not here." But she was on a roll. "You know, everyone here knows the truth," she continued, her voice carrying. "You're just a placeholder, a fake boss playing dress-up in Daddy's suits." That's when the champagne flute went flying. And well, you know the rest. As I stood on the sidewalk outside the plaza, the cool night air hitting my face, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. I had no idea what came next. But for the first time in years, I felt free. I held a cab and gave the driver the address of the only person in New York I knew I could trust. My old college roommate, Mike. He'd moved to the city a few years back to start a small marketing firm. And we'd stayed in touch, even if Sarah had never approved of him. "Jake, my man," Mike exclaimed as he opened the door, taking in my disheveled appearance with raised eyebrows. "What happened to you? Aren't you supposed to be at some fancy schneidig tonight?" I gave him the Cliff Notes version of my dramatic exit. There was a long whistle in response. "Holy shit, dude," Mike said, ushering me inside. "That's some movie-level drama. You okay?" "I think so," I replied, surprising myself with how true it felt. "But I could use a place to crush for a bit while I figure things out." "Say no more," Mike said without hesitation. "Mi casa es su casa. Want a beer?" That night, crushed on Mike's lumpy futon, I slept better than I had in years. In the morning, reality came crushing back in the form of a barrage of missed calls and texts from Sarah, from board members, from lawyers. I ignored them all, focusing instead on figuring out my next move. Mike, true to his word, gave me free rein of his couch and didn't push when I spent days alternating between job searching and binge-watching mindless TV. But after a week of this, he decided enough was enough. "All right, Jakey boy," he said, tossing a pillow at my head. "Time to rejoin the land of the living. Get dressed. We're going out." I protested, but Mike wasn't having it. "Look, man, I get it. You're going through some heavy shit, but you can't hide out here forever. Plus, you're starting to smell. A shower and some human interaction will do you good." Grudgingly, I had to admit he had a point. So I showered, shaved, and let Mike drive me to a dive bar in the East Village, about as far from the upper tea lounges Sarah preferred as he could get. As we nursed our beers, Mike turned to me with a serious expression. "So what's the plan, Jake? You're gonna go back?" I shook my head vehemently. "No way. That bridge is well and truly burned." "Good," Mike nodded. "Because let me tell you, buddy, that world is sucking the life out of you. I haven't seen the real Jake Thompson in years." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. Somewhere along the way, in my desperate attempts to fit into Sarah's world, I'd lost sight of who I really was. "So what now?" I asked, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the possibilities. Mike grinned. Now, my friend, you get to reinvent yourself. And I've got an idea that might help with that. Mike's idea turned out to be a job offer. His marketing firm was expanding, and he needed someone with business acumen to help manage the growth. It's not glamorous, he warned. No corner office, no expense account. But it's honest work and you'd be building something from the ground up. What do you say? I thought about it for all of 2 seconds before breaking into a grin. I say, when do I start? The next few months were a whirlwind. During the day, I threw myself into work at Mike's firm, relishing the challenge of helping a small business grow. At night, I dealt with the fallout from my very public exit from Rothschild Enterprises. Sarah, predictably, was not taking things well. Her lawyers came at me with everything they had, trying to paint me as an incompetent gold digger who had manipulated my way into the company. It was ugly, and there were days when I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake. But then I'd remember the look of contempt in Sarah's eyes that night at the gala, the years of subtle put-downs and not-so-subtle reminders that I didn't belong. And I knew no matter how hard things got, I couldn't go back to that life. The divorce proceedings dragged on for months. Sarah fought tooth and nail for every penny, every share of stock. I found myself grateful for all those years of poring over contracts and financial statements. It meant I could hold my own against her team of high-priced lawyers. In the end, we reached a settlement. I walked away with a fraction of the wealth I'd had access to as CEO of Rothschild Enterprises. But it was enough to ensure I'd never have to worry about money again. More importantly, I walked away with my dignity intact. As the dust settled on my old life, I threw myself into my new one with gusto. Working at Mike's firm was a breath of fresh air. Gone were the cutthroat boardroom battles and constant power plays. Instead, I found myself surrounded by young, hungry creatives who were passionate about their work. You know, Jake, Mike said to me one night as we were burning the midnight oil on a big pitch, I gotta say, I like this version of you a lot better than the stuffed shirt I saw at your wedding. I laughed, realizing he was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd rediscovered the hungry, ambitious kid from Buffalo who'd fallen in love with business in the first place. Yeah, well, I replied, tossing a crumpled-up piece of paper at his head. Turns out you can take the boy out of Buffalo, but you can't take the buffalo out of the boy. As the months turned into a year, I settled into my new life. I rented a modest apartment in Brooklyn, a far cry from the penthouse I'd shared with Sarah, but it felt more like home than that mausoleum ever had. I made new friends, people who liked me for who I was, not for my bank account or my last name. But just as I was starting to feel like I'd finally moved on, the past came knocking in the form of a frantic phone call from my former assistant at Rothschild Enterprises. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice trembling. I know I shouldn't be calling you, but it's bad. The company, it's falling apart. My heart sank. Despite everything, I still cared about the company I'd poured a decade of my life into. What do you mean falling apart? She hesitated, then the words came tumbling out in a rush. After you left, Mrs. Rothschild and her mother took over. But they don't know what they're doing. The new CEO they brought in is running the company into the ground. There are rumors of embezzlement, bad deals. Some of the board members are talking about jumping ship. I felt a complex mix of emotions, concern for the employees whose livelihoods were at stake, a twinge of schadenfreude at Sarah's failure. And if I'm being honest, a spark of excitement at the thought of getting back in the game. Thanks for letting me know, I told her. I'll think about what I can do. I hung up and immediately called my lawyer. How ironclad is that non-compete clause in my settlement? I asked without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jake, he said slowly, what are you thinking and doing? I grinned, feeling more alive than I had in months. I'm thinking it might be time for a comeback tour. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. I reached out to contacts in the industry, piecing together the true state of Rothschild Enterprises. The picture wasn't pretty. The new CEO, a crony of Sarah's mother, had made a series of disastrous investments. Morale was at an all-time low and several key executives had jumped ship. The final straw came when I got wind of a potential hostile takeover bid. A rival firm, smelling blood in the water, was preparing to swoop in and carve up the company Richard had spent his life building. I knew I had to act fast. I called an emergency meeting with my lawyer and financial advisor, outlining my plan. They both thought I was crazy, but I could see the gleam of excitement in their eyes. "You really want to do this?" my lawyer asked. "After everything they put you through?" I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since those early days at the company. "It's not about them," I said. "It's about all the employees who depend on that company for their livelihoods. It's about finishing what Richard started." With their reluctant blessing, I put my plan into motion. I leveraged every contact I had, called in every favor I was owed. Within days, I had assembled a group of investors willing to back my play. Then came the hard part, facing Sarah. I arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in Midtown. When Sarah walked in, I was struck by how different she looked. Gone was the polished socialite I'd been married to. She looked tired, frazzled, the weight of her failures evident in the dark circles under her eyes. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Then I remembered all the times she tore me down, all the years of subtle cruelty, and I steeled myself for what was to come. "Jake," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I have to admit I was surprised to hear from you." "Believe me," I replied, "I'm as surprised to be here as you are." We sat in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, Sarah spoke. "So," she said, a hint of her old sharpness creeping into her voice. "I assume this isn't a social call. What do you want, Jake?" I took a deep breath, then laid out my proposal. I would return to Rothschild Enterprises as CEO, bringing with me a fresh injection of capital from my investor group. In exchange, I wanted a controlling stake in the company. As I spoke, I watched the emotions play across Sarah's face: shock, anger, and finally, a grudging respect. "You've got some nerve," she said when I finished. "After walking out on us, now you want to swoop in and play the hero." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze steadily. "This isn't about playing the hero, Sarah. It's about saving your father's legacy. You know as well as I do that if something doesn't change, there won't be a company left to fight over." She flinched at the mention of her father, and I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "And what makes you think you can save it?" she asked, but there was less bite in her words now. "Because I've done it before," I said simply. "And because despite everything, I still care about what happens to Rothschild Enterprises." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an unreadable expression. Then to my surprise, she let out a short humorless laugh. "You know," she said, "Daddy always said you were the best decision he ever made. I guess he was right after all." She stood up abruptly, smoothing down her designer dress with shaking hands. "I'll talk to Mother and the board." "But Jake," she added, her voice hard. "Don't think for a second this means all is forgiven." I nodded, feeling a mix of triumph and trepidation. "I wouldn't expect it to be." As Sarah walked away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Phase 1 of my plan was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations, board meetings, and late nights poring over financial reports. It wasn't easy convincing the board to accept my offer, but faced with the alternative of a hostile takeover, it eventually came around. And so almost exactly a year after I'd stormed out of that gala, I found myself walking back into the offices of Rothschild Enterprises. The familiar scent of leather and expensive cologne hit me as soon as I stepped off the elevator, bringing with it a flood of memories, some good, some painful. As I made my way to what would once again be my office, I could feel the eyes of every employee on me. Some looked hopeful, others worried. I knew I had my work cut out for me in winning back their trust. My old assistant, the one who had called me with news of the company's troubles, was waiting outside my office, attended a smile on her face. "Welcome back, Mr. Thompson," she said, handing me a stack of files. "These need your immediate attention." I grinned, feeling a surge of excitement at the challenges ahead. "Thanks, Jessica. And please call me Jake." As I settled into my chair, I took a moment to look around the office. It was exactly as I'd left it that night a year ago, right down to the family photo on my desk, a reminder of happier times with Sarah. With a pang, I picked up the photo and tucked it away in a drawer. That chapter of my life was over. It was time to write a new one. The first few months back at Rothschild Enterprises were some of the hardest of my career. The company was in worse shape than I'd initially realized, and for every step forward, it seemed like we took 2 steps back. I worked around the clock, sleeping on the couch in my office more often than not. I had to make tough decisions, cutting unprofitable divisions, letting go of employees who'd been with the company for years. Each choice weighed heavily on me, but I knew it was necessary for the survival of the company as a whole. Sarah and her mother kept their distance, which was both a relief and a strange source of tension. I'd catch glimpses of them at board meetings, Sarah's face an inscrutable mask as I presented my plans for the company's future. Slowly but surely, things began to turn around. A major deal I'd been working on for months finally came through, bringing a much-needed infusion of cash and positive press. Employee morale began to improve as they saw the company stabilizing. It was after closing this deal that I had my first real conversation with Sarah since taking back control of the company. I was working late as usual, where there was a soft knock at my office door. I looked up, surprised to see Sarah standing there. She looked different than she had at the cafe, more put together, but also somehow smaller, less sure of herself. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Sarah sat down, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "I had wanted to congratulate you on the Anderson deal," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's a big win for the company." "Thank you," I replied, unsure where this was going. "It should help stabilize our position in the market." Sarah nodded, then fell silent. I waited, sensing she had more to say. Finally she looked up at me, her blue eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite read. "I owe you an apology, Jake," she said softly. I felt my eyebrows shoot up in surprise. In all the years I'd known Sarah, I'd never heard her apologize to anyone. "I've had a lot of time to think over the past year," she continued, "about the company, about us, about the way I treated you." I remained silent, hardly daring to breathe for fear of breaking this moment of vulnerability. "You were right, you know," Sarah said, a hint of her old wry humor creeping into her voice. "I was threatened by your success. I couldn't stand the idea that you might be better at this than me, that you might be worthy of Daddy's legacy in a way I never could be." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Sarah, I never wanted to replace your father. I just wanted to honor what he built to make him proud." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I know that now, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see it." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstandings and hurt feelings hanging between us. Finally I spoke. "I'm sorry too," I said. "I should have stood up for myself sooner, should have talked to you about how I was feeling instead of letting it build up." Sarah gave me a watery smile. "We made quite a mess of things.